Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let me introduce our really very prominent speaker. Please sit down. Who's, in spite of this fact that he's really very prominent speaker and former Secretary General of NATO, nowadays he's advisor of well-known energy company BP. Previously, Mr. Robertson served as Vice President of TNK BP, this Russian British or Russian-British American company which operated in Russia for more than 10 years. But despite all these facts, Mr. Robertson is quite often guest here. He was at the MGIMO at least 2 times before. And that's why he knows the audience. And I guess our meeting will be quite informal. We have about 45 minutes for the presentation, and then question answers period. So I give the floor to Mr. Robertson. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's very good to be back at MGIMO. I have memories of being before. My memories mainly are of very tough questions posed by very clever people. But these were in the past, so I'm waiting to see what happens today and whether you will rise to the challenge. Maybe I won't speak as long as the Deputy Director says, in order to allow more time for questions, because I'm sure that you've got quite a lot of things that you that you might want to ask me rather than what I tell you. It's now 10 years since I was Secretary General of NATO. During my period in NATO, we had 9/11, the attack on New York and on Washington by Al-Qaeda terrorists. We had almost a war in Macedonia. Then we had the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. It was quite a busy period. We also created the NATO-Russia Council at a famous meeting in 2002 when President Vladimir Putin came and sat round the same table with all of the other 19 heads of state and heads of government of the NATO countries as an equal participant in what was to be the first meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. Sadly, it hasn't has been as successful as people thought that day, but it was a historic moment, and the Council still exists and is still a forum where matters of mutual interest can be addressed. When I went to NATO, I was reminded of what the first Secretary General of NATO said. General Lord Ismay was the first Secretary General of NATO. He was British like I am. He was a military officer, but also Chief of Staff to Winston Churchill during the Second World War, then a cabinet minister, and then the first Secretary General of NATO. And he very memorably once said the job of NATO was to keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. These epithets lasted a long time. When I was at NATO, starting in 1999, at the beginning of the 21st century, I redefined it as keeping the Americans in, trying to get the Russians in, and trying to get Germany to spend more money on defense. So that encompasses the distance between 1949 and 1999, when I became the Secretary General. But as your Deputy Director has said, since then I've moved into the world of business, and my main responsibility was to be the Deputy Chairman of the very large and successful joint venture between BP British oil company, and TNK, a Russian oil company run by 4 individual Russians. And I served in that company on the board of directors and chairman of its audit committee until earlier this year, when the company was bought by Rosneft. And I'm now simply an advisor to BP. I just want to make a few introductory remarks about the world as I see it today. The world that you face is much more complicated than that has been seen by previous generations who came and studied at MGIMO and went out into the world of diplomacy and commerce. There's no single enemy. There is no confrontation between one great ideology and another great ideology. There are virtually no existential threats to our countries. Nuclear deterrence means that the kind of war that was fought in Europe between 1939 and 1945 and between 1914 and 1918 is unimaginable today. But the complexity of the world means that there are still problems, there are still threats, but we need to find new and different answers. It was actually a famous Russian who recently said about the world, he said, "The enemy has not gone away, it has just become more dispersed." And that is, in many ways, the problem that we now face in the world today. It was relatively easy during the Cold War. You had 2 competing ideologies. You had Stalin's Russia and you had the West after the Second World War, and that went on virtually until 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. And there are still people in the world today who are nostalgic for the simplicity of that kind of world. You knew who the enemy was, and you could therefore configure your forces, your society, your defenses in relation to that one single enemy. It isn't as easy to do that now, and clearly a lot of people are now struggling with the effects that have taken. We live in a complex and a very unstable world. We're seeing a transition from the West to the East, from the North to the South. So the old certainties have gone, and new realities are now facing us. We have huge new economic powers, Brazil, India, China, who are not yet strategic or military powers, not yet, although they aspire to it. But their economic power and clout is making sure that they cannot be missed out of any of the equations that we have in the world. But there are new threats that we have to face. My generation, which is disappearing from the face of public platforms, to your generation, who will have to face the realities of what we have generously left behind for you. Usually high debt, aging populations dependent upon younger generations' earning power. Such is the generosity that societies will have to bear, and Russia no less than any of the Western countries as a whole. New threats in the world today, some of them very, very potent threats. Indeed, global terrorism is just one, but it's all pervasive. Small in nature, but very big in impact. And we can see what happens recently in Nairobi, in Kenya. The supermarket siege, large numbers of people killed, huge amount of damage, a whole world engulfed by fascination in what happened in that shopping mall in Nairobi. And at the end of it all, we find out that it was committed by 4 individuals. 4 individuals with a lot of guns, a lot of nerve, and total brutality. So 4 people can engender the world's attention in many ways beyond what regional wars used to do in the past. There's the problems and dangers of proliferation in the world today, from nuclear technology through other weapons of mass destruction like chemical and biological weapons, right down to the proliferation of handguns in the world, which make some countries so dangerous as well. We now have more failed and fragile states in the world. Countries like Afghanistan under the Taliban, or Somalia today, countries whose very internal instability spreads to the outside world. It was as a result of Somalia that the 4 terrorists in Nairobi were able to commit the damage that they actually did. But fragile and failed states are now a serious spreading problem in the world because their effects are not limited to these states. They spread to others, and you only have to look at Syria, which I'll come on to in a minute, to see how quickly a local war, an internal conflict, can rapidly become the problem of neighbouring states, and indeed many states long, long away from them itself. We're faced with climate change, extreme weather. Our television screens in the last few days have been dominated by a typhoon in the Philippines, with the damage that has been created, almost the damage of a nuclear explosion committed by one typhoon. And you only have to remember the problems associated with the tsunamis and the earthquakes that we've seen in the last few years to realize that something is happening to the world's weather systems. And what the point I would make to you about that is, first of all, it causes problems with population movements. And we will see, as extreme weather takes its toll, large numbers of people seeking to go from countries where there is a shortage of water and other natural resources. And these population movements and migrations will not be popular with domestic populations. You can see that in Russia, where the mixing of different cultures is so difficult now to cope with. And secondly, we seem incapable of learning from each one of these natural disasters about how to actually deal with it. The one commodity that is required in each one of these natural disasters is helicopters. The only way that you can get aid, and there's lots of aid available for the Philippines today, into countries where the civil distribution and the normal communications have collapsed, is actually through helicopters. And in the tsunami of a few years ago, the biggest single assistance to recovery there was the United States aircraft carrier battle group, which was diverted to Southeast Asia, because an aircraft carrier battle group has got hospitals, it's got fresh water producing machinery, and it's got food, and they've got helicopters to get the aid to people. So, you know, we tend not to think about natural disasters and military equipment and capabilities in the same phrase, but actually they are intimately connected and need to be seen in the same picture. We have now the danger in the world today of pandemics. After the First World War, Spanish flu killed millions of people. Almost as many people died in the Spanish flu outbreak after the First World War as died in the First World War. But it took months for it to spread throughout the different countries and years for the impact to be felt. In contrast, the SARS virus, which was from the Asia-Pacific region, traveled to 4 continents in 24 hours. Our world is so interconnected now, not just in communications, but in terms of physical travel, that a pandemic, once it starts, can have huge consequences as well. Then we have organized crime, a major threat to all our societies. Organized crime, now a bigger industry in financial terms than petroleum is today. And it threatens not only democracies with the corruption and the underlying corrosion that it has, but obviously affects security as well. For the criminals, boundaries and borders mean very, very little indeed. And you can see that on a daily basis. We may have ended, after the Cold War, wars between states, but now we have more and more wars inside states. And we begin to see the problems associated with religious and political extremism taking place. Divisions even within religions. The conflict between Shia and Sunni Islam is now one of the biggest factors in creating the difficulties that we're seeing in the Middle East and way beyond the Middle East as well. Piracy on the high seas, almost a historic problem which was sorted generations, centuries ago, has now reappeared. A NATO-led force which included ships of the Russian Navy and the Chinese Navy has controlled it in East Africa and in the Indian Ocean, but now we're beginning to see piracy develop on the west of Africa as well. So our sea lanes, once clear for international transit, are now being affected by one of the oldest threats that the world has seen. We also, as we saw only a few years ago, have got financial interconnectivity such that if something goes wrong in one small part of the financial infrastructure across the world, then the whole system can be under threat. If you mis-sell mortgages in the southern states of the United States of America through fraudulent financial engineering, it can very quickly turn into an epidemic. And the world's financial system stood right on the edge of a cliff, almost going into a financial meltdown. That wasn't possible in days gone by. It's a very recent phenomenon where we're all part of this global village, with global banks susceptible to the tiniest of interaction in some of the remotest parts of the world as well. So these are just a few of the modern threats, and as you will easily see, they are not confined to any country, to any part of the world. They're not confined to the east or to the west or to the north or to the south. The divisions that existed between the old communist world and the old Western world have disappeared completely. We are all vulnerable to all of these threats, and it's actually, in my view, urgent that we deal with them and we find solutions to them, and we do so collectively. No single country in the world, however big, however economically powerful, however powerful militarily, can actually deal with problems to do with the environment, with climate change, with terrorism and proliferation. So we live now in an interconnected but hugely interdependent world as well. And one of the problems that we face in the world, in my view, is that as the problems have gone global, the politics have become more local. People are looking to their own governments, to their own local councils, to their own local entities for solutions to problems that cannot be solved on a local basis. And it's one of the great paradoxes of our time that we're faced with this contrast between local politics, where people are engaged, and international politics, where people don't understand or feel far too remote from it as well. And we need to somehow deal with that. And it will require this generation, your generation, to rise to the challenge of modernizing international institutions, of telling leaders of today that they are not sufficiently rising to the challenge that faces the world as a whole today, in order to create the institutions that will actually start to manage the problems and make the world a safer and much more prosperous affair. You know, when I was in TNK-BP, we had 4 of Russia's great oligarchs as our partners in that. Mr. Friedman, Mr. Vekselberg, Mr. Blavadnik were the 3 partners that we had. And I remember one of them saying to me about the way in which they did business. And he said, you're either at the lunch or you're on the menu. And it was a brutal point of view to take it, but it applies not just in the world of business, but in the world of geopolitics as well. You know, we can't afford to simply be on the menu of problems. We need to be at the lunch where the decisions are made, and that is what I tried to do when I was in NATO. Just let me come to a conclusion and allow your questions, but let me just look at Syria today, because here Russia suddenly has taken the initiative, and Russia has become involved in finding a solution rather than being part of the problem. And the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime actually brought the world to the point where they said, we need to do something together. And now there is a collective response led by Russia, the United States, and the other permanent members of the Security Council, and that, you know, is a bright moment in international politics, and it can be replicated, and it should be replicated in other areas too. But Syria is the great example of how interdependent we all are. Syria is a country most people didn't know much about. People went there as tourists, and because it was a police state, it was very quiet, very nice, and you could see the tourist scenes with relative peace. But eventually all dictatorships blow up, and they release demons that have been kept hidden under the surface. And now the conflict in Syria, with a population rising up against the dictatorship of Assad, his father, and the regime, has led to the fragmentation of the country, to a conflict that has killed over 100,000 civilians in that country, and which has tipped hundreds of thousands of refugees into the surrounding countries. Turkey has 500,000 Syrian refugees. Lebanon has got more than 300,000. 1 in every 3 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. Jordan, a small and fragile country anyway, has already got some 300,000 refugees. The second biggest city in Jordan today is the refugee camp on the border with Syria, and they're having to turn people back into the war zones because they simply can't cope. And this is in the most volatile part of the world today. So a civil war starts up, gets out of control. We now know that some 75% possibly of the opponents of the Assad regime are actually now controlled by Al-Qaeda. And you have to wonder, why did we let it get so far that these people have managed to be in command of the opposition forces, when half the world's countries recognized the moderate opposition to Assad at the beginning of this conflict? So here you see encapsulated the dilemma for the world today. A small war in a small country becomes a huge global issue with its repercussions flowing across borders and across continents as well. Now, eventually Syria will be sorted. It'll take a long time for that to happen, perhaps, given the nature of what's happening today, but it will be sorted, as most conflicts have been. And I keep saying to people, don't be depressed simply because of what today's newspapers and today's television pictures say. The human race has got a capacity to deal with problems in the world. In Bosnia, in the Balkans, 1990 a war started. By 1992 it was out of control and almost medieval violence was taking place. By 1995, under a United Nations resolution, military force was used against President Milosevic of Yugoslavia, and it ended the war at that point. And Bosnia is now a stable nation state with a football team that is in the qualifying rounds for the Brazil World Cup, so, and entries in the Eurovision Song Contest. So you can't get much better in terms of civilization than that, can you, I ask? South Africa moved from apartheid to majority rule without bloodshed. Northern Ireland is now at peace, despite the fact that in my own country for 400 years, we had a civil war going on in a small part of that as well. So we can deal with Syria and with Iran and with North Korea and with the Middle East peace process if we're optimistic enough, if we're practical enough, and if we cooperate enough. And that, therefore, is my final bit of advice to all of you. You are going to be the successor generation, going out into the world and actually making it happen or not making it happen. I wish you well in the mission that you have in the future, and I hope you do a better job than my generation did. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such an overarching, I would say, presentation, which I guess could provoke many questions on any subject, since you've covered nearly everything. Okay, the floor is yours, dear colleagues. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. My question would be about the European Union foreign policy, and these days it's getting more force and more significant in the world arena, global arena. What consequences would that make for NATO as an organization? Do you think that if European Union develops its own foreign policy, which is strong and united, would that be in competition with, for example, NATO?
No, it's a good question, and a lot of people ask it, including people in the United States. I don't think that it's any threat to NATO. NATO is a defense organization, but it is largely a security organization. It deals with the politics of security as well as the military hardware of security. And therefore, if the European Union has a stronger role in foreign policy, then that can only be to the good. Because the nations, the 28 nations, the 27 nations of the European, is it 27? I've forgotten how many now it is. 28, well, Croatia has just begun. 28 countries of the European Union make up a very sizable proportion of Western Europe. And therefore, if they speak with one voice, as indeed they are doing just now on the Iranian negotiations, then it makes life simpler, and it adds clout to the negotiations taking place. If the European Union decides it will do more in defense, then so be it. When the action was taken against Libya, the Americans stood back. They took their commanders out of the military chain, and they left it to the Europeans. So if the European Union countries, and largely they are also NATO countries, get more military capabilities, then that will help NATO's capabilities as well. So we need more modern capabilities in the world today for today's threats, not yesterday's threats. And I noticed that Mr. Shoigu has been arguing exactly the same point in terms of Russia. Russia needs to modernize its armed forces. Far too many conscripts who are useless in any military context. But he wants to go for more reservists and more professional forces. That's the only way that you can deal with it. And why we need so many battle tanks, I'll never understand. There are 10,000 main battle tanks in Western European countries, and no role for them at all, none at all. So, you know, both Russia and the NATO countries need to get fewer of the old Cold War capabilities and get more of the capabilities that will deal with the kind of threats that I outlined there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Here is the next one. And please don't talk simultaneously with the load. Huh? Try to make it.
Thank you very much for your delivery and coming over. I'm Nikita Bulovsky, a student of master's program on international relations, and you made us reminiscent of the fact that there was a mode in the 20th century concerning the fact that NATO had to put Russia down and keep it down. And just put it directly, there is still a drive and a need to keep Russia down now within NATO?
No.
That's the first question. And the second one, if there is no such a drive and need, what makes NATO, say, reluctant to develop any cooperation with Russia in terms of air defense systems? Thank you very much.
Should we take the next question? Yeah, please.
Mr. Robertson, it has become an axiom that facing global problems requires global efforts. However, as all the sovereign nations are considered equal in their rights, consensus between them is never possible. And the problems of the Doha round of WTO or the Kyoto process are a nice example of that. Is there nothing that can be done about that, or does humanity need a global crisis in order to get things done?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Does NATO still want to keep Russia down? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, I came, it's interesting that there should be giggles at that, you know. That's very worrying, you know. And, you know, I read the Moscow Times when I came on Monday, and I saw this headline that Mr. Shoigu said, the biggest threats to Russia are terrorism and NATO enlargement. And I thought, this is crazy. So NATO enlargement is a bigger threat than proliferation, bigger than organized crime, bigger than failed states in the world, bigger than religious fundamentalism. It's just not right. Actually, NATO enlargement has provided for Russia one of the safest areas on its borders that it has ever had in its whole history. It was Catherine the Great who once said the only way that Russia can secure its borders is by expanding them. That was her theory. Now there are a set of peaceful, organized, democratic nations right down the western border of Russia, predictable, manageable, with good relations with all of them. And that is by and large because these countries joined the European Union and they joined NATO, and it helped to stabilize them in the aftermath of the communist years. So I can't understand why people in Russia still think that NATO is some foreign instrument of domination. NATO is a defensive organization, always has been and always will be, and it's got Russians at its heart. Even in the darkest days, after the Cold War ended, we had Russian soldiers, we had Russian military experts, Russian diplomats in the NATO campus. There all the time. My Russian ambassador when I was in NATO, Sergei Kislyak, is now the ambassador to the United States of America. He was regularly in my office. We created a NATO-Russia Council that met on a monthly basis at ambassadorial level. We need to face these problems together. And if you read the Moscow Times today, there's an article in the editorial page by Alexander Vershba, who's the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, saying that it is an open invitation to Russia to deal with exactly what you said, and that is missile defense. NATO's missile defense plans are based on intermediate and short-range ballistic missiles, not on intercontinental ballistic missiles, but we want to, NATO, sorry, I shouldn't say we, I'm not there anymore, but NATO wants to talk with Russia about these kind of threats and these kind of problems. And that's what we should be doing. There is no intent. Russia is not an enemy. There are enough enemies for all of us out there in the world today without us conjuring up images of the past. Now, I know Mr. Shoigu from his days as the Minister for Emergencies, and NATO collaborated on a lot of emergencies and gave help and assistance throughout the world, as well as in Russia, with emergencies that took place. So I don't agree with what he said in that respect. Coming on to the second question, I think, as I said, these problems of national sovereignty are a real problem, with people pretending they can have national solutions to what are international problems. And I fear you're probably right. It will only be when there is another international crisis that people will actually get round the same table again. Well, they did it 2 weekends ago about Iran, when the new president of Iran, Mr. Rouhani, who incidentally got his doctorate degree in Glasgow, at Glasgow Caledonian University. Mr. Malayan, who's just come back from the Russian embassy in London, will have heard me tell the story before, that the difference between the New York mafia and the Glasgow mafia is that the New York mafia make you an offer you can't refuse. The Glasgow mafia make you an offer you can't understand. So Mr. Rouhani got his doctorate in Glasgow, so maybe he's picked up some of the good habits of the great people of Glasgow. But that was the international community seeing an opportunity and getting round a table. It was similar over chemical weapons in Syria. It was also quite similar when the economic crisis developed in 2008. People said, we must do something, save the world's the financial system. And they did, but they did it together. And I think there needs to be more examples of that, and more politicians need to stop pleading with people to suggest that there are nationalist solutions to problems that are actually internationalist in their nature. I hope you're all understanding what I say in my West of Scotland accent.
I guess it's even easier to understand for the Russians. Yeah. And then I'll call again.
Thank you very much for the speech. I'm a student of first course of Masters in International Relations. So you managed several NATO operations that, in your opinion, that were successful. First, you mentioned Bosnia and said that Bosnia now is a stable nation state. Well, actually, we are here studying international relations and the Balkans as well, and we know that Bosnia is not a stable state and is not nation state for sure, because it's ruled by a representative of the European Union, and actually it's absolutely failed state. So this was like the result of operation in NATO there. Then it was Kosovo, where terrorists and drug traffickers are in power now, and unfortunately West cooperates with them, such as Hashim Tachi. I think all you can agree with that. Then was and then Libya, when country actually got into terrible collapse and bloodshed. So in these circumstances, how do you think? What do you think? Why every Russian leader comes in power as a pro-Western, absolutely, as Yeltsin was, as Putin was when he came, and every Russian leader has a hope that Russia will be the heart of the West. But in the end of his mandate, he becomes absolutely anti-Western. How you can explain this tendency?
Next question, and meanwhile you will think it. You'll think the answer. Here we have the privilege of the microphones. Yeah, here it is. Probably we have.
Thank you for, sir. My question concerns Iran and the prospect of NATO collaboration with Iran.
Slightly louder.
Because we know that Afghanistan, issue of Afghanistan, Afghanistan was one of the issues that was in common with Iran. And now, after 2014, we know that we need the transition of equipments out of Afghanistan. Do you think that Iran and NATO can reach an agreement that we see transition of equipments through Iran to Oman Sea, or we can't be such optimists about future relations?
Okay, these are good questions. Let me first of all address these failures of Western policy, as you might characterize them. Well, I once met Joe Biden when he was a senator and not the Vice President of the United States of America. And an informal group, he was saying, he said, I had 2 brain tumors. And he said, I had them taken out. He said, and people said, I was very brave. He said, what's brave about it? Was I supposed to leave them in? And I use that as an example of saying, what if we hadn't acted in Bosnia? And remember, we acted with the UN mandate and with the support of the Russian Federation when we did act. Bosnia would have been a graveyard of millions of people destroyed, as indeed Milosevic was fully intending. If we had not acted in Kosovo, when Milosevic was intent on driving all of the ethnic Albanians, who made up 85% of the population of Kosovo, if we hadn't acted there, what if we had allowed Colonel Gaddafi to annihilate the population of Benghazi, which was what he was going to do in order to quell a revolt by all of the people? So, before you criticize the aftermath, which is relatively easy to do because none of these things are neat and tidy, you have to look at what the alternative would have been if we hadn't acted in the first place. And these consequences would have been mighty, and they would have been terrible, and they would have been unacceptable in the world as a whole. So Bosnia is still not perfect, but people are not killing each other, and they're getting down to dealing with currency and with trade and with exports and with getting involved in the World Cup and the Eurovision Song Contest, so it's not a failed state. It's gradually growing into a state that will have aspirations towards joining the European Union and NATO probably as well, just as Serbia is doing at the moment. And Kosovo, where an agreement has been brokered by the European Union High Representative to allow Serbia to start its accession process towards the European Union. So, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't know what's going to happen in Libya. It's not nice and it's not pretty at the moment. But you don't get rid of a dictator without there being enormous consequences. When the Soviet Union ceased to be a dictatorship, ceased to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, then it splintered in a way that would have been unimaginable some 20 or 30 years ago if a lecturer had come to МГИМО and talked about it there as well. So transitions are not going to be easy, simple, risk-free processes. They will take time to work through. But there are times in the world, like in Afghanistan, where again a Russian-backed UN Security Council resolution was taken in order to get rid of the Taliban because they refused to hand over the representatives of Al-Qaeda who were there. And Afghanistan under the Taliban and Afghanistan hosting Al-Qaeda was actually a bigger and closer threat to Russia than it actually was to the United States of America at that time. And that is why throughout the whole of the 11 years that NATO has been holding, the reins in Afghanistan, it has done so with a lot of active engagement by the Russian Federation as well, because Russia knows where the threats to its own borders are actually held as well. Why do all of the presidents of Russia come in as pro-Western and end up anti-Western? Well, I don't think that President Putin would regard himself as anti-Western. He's certainly disillusioned, and I think in some respects he's right. I think some of the original cooperation that he pioneered, some of the original ambitions he had to be part of Western Europe. I was basically his first foreign visitor, even before he became president in the year 2000. And then that was his ambition. I think it was frustrated by events, partly by the nature of the American administration, and partly because maybe people in both Russia and its more conservative elements, as well as conservative elements in the West, were not ready for the kind of engagement that was envisaged at that time. Maybe the cooperation over Syria has changed that, and we might begin to see more cooperation. And I hope the President becoming a little less sceptical about the West than sometimes he appears to be today. I'm going to the Kremlin this evening to see the head of the presidential administration, Sergei Ivanov, who was my opposite number as defense minister at the time, and who remains a good friend as well. The question about Iran, and do I envisage Iran allowing or being asked to take equipment from Afghanistan? No, I don't think we are that far down the road. It would be nice to think that we could have relations with Iran that stopped them aspiring to have nuclear weapons. And that is the objective of what is known as the P5+1. And I think Russia has got as much of an interest in making sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons as any of the other permanent members of the Security Council. But we've got some way to go before relations will be normalized with Iran, so that you could start bringing equipment through Iran and taking it out from Afghanistan. That's even a bit more optimistic than I would go.
Okay. Please. And to other questions. The fourth. That was a very indecisive hand from the very beginning, and finally he decided to ask.
Do you think that Russia should enter NATO, and do you think that Russia will ever be part of the European Union? Thank you.
Probably we gather these three questions. Коллеги, дайте микрофон.
First of all, thank you for your presentation, and I've got two questions. How would you comment on the implementation of the Aegis system in Romania this year? And why the NATO could not guarantee Russia that it is not directed against her? Thank you.
How could not guarantee against what?
I could not guarantee that it is not directed against the Russian Federation.
Right. Do I envisage Russia being in NATO? Yes. I don't see why not. I think that we're getting to the point, I think, where we're talking about an organization that is very different to the Cold War NATO. The Cold War NATO was a small number of countries who banded together in 1949 in order to stop Stalin's march across Europe. Had it not been for NATO, and NATO as an organization, there is little doubt that that Austria would have fallen, Finland would have fallen, and maybe even Italy would have fallen in the way that Stalin was determined to take over a sizable part of Europe. So that was its role, and it was a number of countries who remarkably, very, very remarkably subordinated that one element of national sovereignty that is the most precious of all, and that is their armed forces. That if there was an attack on one country, then all of the countries would say that was an attack on them, and all of their armed forces would come under the control of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and indeed the political control of the North Atlantic Council and its Secretary General. That was, I think, if you look back in history, is something absolutely dramatic and completely fundamental. But it was in the face of a threat that was acknowledged to be very great at that time. Gradually, more countries have joined. There are now 28 countries in NATO, and that makes it a very different organization to the one that was there throughout the 1950s and indeed the 1960s as well. We also have the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, the Partnership for Peace, which embraces all of the ex-Soviet countries right across to the Chinese border, and including the neutral countries and including Belarus. I used to chair the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, which met every month. And we had countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan sitting around the table, separated by Austria, because everything in NATO is done by the alphabet, you know. So countries technically still at war, actually sitting around the table and discussing matters of mutual security. So NATO became much less of a purely military organization, although its military effect was very substantial. Its headquarters, it's called SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, is basically a large military command structure. And it's been used not only in Afghanistan, it's been used in Darfur to help the African Union. It was deployed to Pakistan to deal with the earthquake. You know, SHAPE has got that power. But I don't see why, with Russia sitting in SHAPE, sitting in the NATO campus in Brussels, should not ultimately become part of a more general security organization that would look after the security of the whole of the European continent. And I think that might well happen. I chaired the NATO-Russia Council in Italy in 2002, a remarkable meeting with President Putin sitting around the table with President Bush, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schroeder, all of the leaders of the so-called Western countries. And we actually agreed in that meeting as to what was going to happen and the cooperation that would take place. That's maybe become slightly unfashionable. There's no reason why it can't happen again. Membership of the European Union, well, why not? Why not? Why shouldn't? This is a modern country. It's a growing country. It's got a financially robust economic system. There's no reason why in the future it should not see itself as being part of an economic union like the European Union, and a political union that is actually adding stability to where the world is today. In terms of, I thought I dealt with the Aegis system in Romania, and if you read what Ambassador Vershbow says, Deputy Secretary General Vershbow says in the Moscow Times today, you'll see the argument that these systems are not capable of dealing with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Therefore, they are no threat to Russia's ICBM defense forces at all. They are short range, and they should and could easily be the subject of joint cooperation between Russia and NATO, and that offer is still on the table.
Okay. Now, two short questions, then two short answers, sorry, and then we return back to the director. Please.
Thank you for your speech and your answers. My name is Alexander. So, through all your speech, you tried to lower our impression of the potential threat that NATO has to Russia. But our knowledge of history, I think, cannot allow us to ignore the fact that the very essence of NATO and its very establishment was once against Russia. And so we all can admit that the situation has changed dramatically and completely. Now our partners say that we are friends. But we also know that our government has taken some steps to seek for a compromise, to
the question, please.
To develop
really
the missile defense together. So why was this initiative rejected? Thank you.
And the last question. Just give me.
Only one question from a woman. This is not healthy for the future of Russia, I think.
No, simply they ask military questions.
Hello. I wanted to ask a question about the NATO's approach to modern security challenges. Over the last 2 decades, it seems that NATO has been trying to develop a single strategy that would work in at least most cases of a serious security challenge. But in every single case that it actually had to confront one, it had to adopt a more flexible approach. And do you think it is even possible to figure out a single strategy that would cover today's very diverse security challenges, and is that even necessary? Or could we simply go for a purely flexible approach and tailor our solutions to every case? And wouldn't that be more effective?
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. There is no single strategy because there is no single threat. There was a single strategy during the Cold War because there was a Warsaw Pact and there was the Soviet Union, and there was a view that they were aggressive and that they would take every opportunity, and therefore the single strategy was a defensive one, purely and totally defensive. Throughout the whole history of NATO, it has simply been a defensive organization, during the period of the Soviet Union. And indeed, when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, it was NATO that was there to help Russia and the former Soviet countries to manage the transition, especially in their militaries, from command economies and command militaries, to the kind of armed forces that Russia and the Warsaw Pact countries now have as well. So we've got to be flexible. The problems are flexible. The problems are going to come at us from all sorts of directions. I don't know whether one's life gets to the point where you don't know what you're talking to an audience that was in primary or nursery school when I was Minister of Defense, but you know of the submarine Kursk that sank off the north of Russia. I was on holiday at the time. I was Secretary General of NATO. We got the telephone call. It was happening. I told them to phone Russia immediately and say that we would offer any help that the NATO countries could give in that circumstance. So at that time, Marshal Sergeyev, who was the defense minister of Russia, was saying it was probably a NATO submarine that had rammed the Kursk. And that there was no way they needed any NATO help at all. 24 hours later, after that public statement, we had 4 Russian admirals on the doorstep of NATO headquarters in Brussels, and it was actually a submarine from one of the NATO countries that actually managed to get in to the stricken submarine, and to find that, of course, it had nothing to do with a collision, that it was an explosion on board the submarine. So, that's where you've got to be flexible, and we all have to be flexible because the enemies that we have are flexible and everywhere as well. And I say, to the young student, to say the essence of NATO was never offensive, never ever offensive. It was designed to stop Stalin and the Soviet Union from its natural inclination to overrun Western Europe. It had no aggressive impulses whatsoever. It exercised, it rehearsed, it planned, it programmed over all of the year, and never fired a shot in anger until 1995, when with Russia it stopped the carnage that was going on in the Balkans. That was the first time any offensive action was taken by NATO at all, and it was done alongside Russia. So there's absolutely no question about NATO having or likely to have any offensive view about the Russian Federation today. And the sooner this gets out of people's mentality on either side of the argument, whether it be in the conservative elements in the United States, or right-wing elements in the United States, or conservative elements in Russia, the easier it will be to deal with the common problems that we have today. And I hope all of you will, in looking at the lessons of history, will see that recent history has been one where collaboration works and division is disaster.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for asking questions. Спасибо, ребята.